this idea that religious people are not necessarily what we call inherently protected from becoming depressed simply because they are religious. Reality is depression is something that, you know, it crosses all bounds and all, you know, socioeconomic, ethnic, religious, none of that matters. We're all prone to it. Now, what Islam promises is this. Islam does not say that because you are a Muslim, you will never be depressed. Islam says that because you are a Muslim, you have access to the tools that Islam gives you. If you're depressed, it will prevent you from going into despair. So religion prevents despair. It does not prevent, inherently, it does not prevent depression.
Depression is a real thing. Mental illness is a real thing. It's not, you know, this idea that many in the Muslim community tend to jump straight to that it's sihr, or that it's some jinn or something. I mean, a lot of superstitious ideas creep up and come up. And not only do some of our brothers and sisters have to struggle with mental illness and depression, they also have to be stigmatized for it. And in fact, the Muslim community doesn't generally look too fondly upon people who go to see psychiatrists or a psychologist or a mental health professional of any kind. Counselors even, marriage counseling, all of these things. I mean, real issues, social and familial issues, are being driven out from their professional sources and outsourced to imams who are not trained in any of this stuff. We have this idea that the fact that somebody has studied Islam makes them qualified to talk about everything and deal with everything and anything, which is totally absurd. Your depression could in fact be a real medical issue. What you'll need to do is actually go to a psychiatrist, go to a mental health professional, get assessed properly. There are certain chemicals and neurotransmitters in the brain that, if they're out of balance, they will impact your life. And for people who tell those who have depression, just think positively, you need to stop, because it's not as simple as, depression is not just, oh, I'm feeling down, I'm a little bit sad. We all go through, I'm feeling down, I'm a little bit sad. These are just normal cycles of mental health. But depression is quite debilitating. Those people, when they go through the stuff, it's literally like having I don't know, it's almost like you're asking somebody who's had their legs amputated to walk. Get up and walk. Or somebody that just became paralyzed, get up and walk. They literally can't. And we have this idea that mental health is not real. You know, just because because it has a psychological aspect that may not be measured, we treat it as if it's not a real thing. We only look at physical maladies as real. And in a sense, that's almost like telling someone who has a migraine or a very strong headache, it's just in your head, it's not real, it doesn't exist. Meanwhile, this person is debilitated. And it's not something, depression is also not something that you can just tell them, go read some Quran, or make them even feel worse about their own Islam. Oh, you're a bad Muslim. You have a crisis of faith, and that's why you're depressed. You need to connect back with Allah. This is a multifaceted, very complex issue. And we're making it worse by not training as Muslims, having some Muslim psychiatrists, practicing Muslim psychiatrists who studied Islam, because we believe that the human being is not just a body. It's not just this physical entity. Yes, you have the brain and the chemicals and the neurotransmitters and all these things, but you also have a spirit, a ruh. And if you don't handle these things in their proper ways and approach them with the proper methodologies that they need to be approached with, because the spirit, the soul, has different medication than the brain requires. So if you go to somebody that has depression and it's a physical issue with neurotransmitters and such, and tell them just go read some Quran, you haven't solved the problem. So you need to approach it from these different angles, and you need somebody who's well versed and well entrenched in both fields in a strong enough fashion that they can address this properly. But for the Muslim community, we really have to acknowledge the existence of the problem before we begin to solve the problem. Depression is a real thing. It's not just about being sad. Suicidal thoughts are not a sin in of themselves. In and of themselves. They're not a sin like that. People getting these thoughts, it's a multitude of things.
Now, keep in mind that depression is not necessarily a character weakness. People would deem depression to be, oh, come on, just trying, to shake people out of it, and they would give you that pep talk. When the going gets tough, the tough get going.
Yeah.
Or hard times don't last, but tough people do. Well, these are beautiful words, but they really do not eliminate depression. So depression is not seen as a personal weakness of the individual. So please, if you know anybody that is depressed out there, make sure that you do not attribute depression to their weakness, because it's not. Depression also is not the result of weak faith. And that is something that we hear amongst religious groups, and that is, oh, the person's faith in God is not that strong. That is why they are depressed. And that is not real. What it really is that at this point, the pain that you are going through is so overwhelming, and you do not have enough tools to deal with the pain. So you go into depression. That's basically, in simple words, that is really what it means. See, think about depression like falling into a hole, Eddie, okay? And this is for the viewers as well. But that hole is not stagnant. The hole is either getting deeper or you're trying to crawl out of it. And the longer that we stay in that hole, the deeper it gets. But also the deeper it gets, the more difficult it gets to get out of it. And the more hopeless we become as a result. So usually what we want to see is that once a person recognizes this, that they're depressed, and we usually do, and then again, depending on the severity of it. So we would say that a person is depressed. It's either, minor depression, or it's mild, they would call it. It's either moderate or it is severe. And when it gets severe, we're talking a person being negligent of their personal hygiene. For example, they don't go to work anymore. Their performance is just, and their functionality is impacted by this. They started performing very poorly academically. In their relationship, they start neglecting their responsibility towards their loved ones. And that's when they can have suicidal thoughts, or they can actually start having psychosis, which means that, their perception of reality is disturbed at this point. So what we are looking at is we want to make sure that the minute we notice it, then we want to make sure that we take early prevention. So the very first tool that I would, point our attention to is this whole idea of early prevention. If you detect it, if you sense it, do something about it. And basically, because depression is all about doing nothing, it's just people idling, and there is really nothing happening, the very first thing that we want to do is actually begin by doing something.
Doing something, as opposed to doing nothing.
Exactly. And the point is that this helps people in really getting out of it, remaining to be functional despite the fact that they are depressed. Now, there is this thing about being an alcoholic and a functioning alcoholic. You can be depressed and functionally you're also, you're okay. It's a lesser form of depression at that point. We also want to make sure that you surround yourself with a good support system. That is when family members come in. That is when friends come in. You're talking about people who have committed suicide, okay? They say that about 80% of the people, before they completed their suicide, they called the loved one. They called the loved one, okay? There was this story about this young man. He was determined in San Francisco that he was going to go to the Golden Gate Bridge, and that he was going to throw himself down unless somebody asks about him. So he said that he actually made it to the Golden Gate Bridge, and he said that a couple came and they handed him a camera and asked if he can take their photo. He said, I took their photo, but they did not ask how I was doing. So he threw himself down, but he did not die, and that's how we know the story. So the idea is that even when people are depressed and they get into that stage of despair and they no longer want to live, they usually reach out to somebody before they do that. So if you are a parent and your teenage son or daughter, they've been talking to you about depression, please take that seriously. If you're a friend and somebody has reached out to you saying that I really don't want to live anymore, please take that seriously. One great tool that we really like to do is something that we call relabeling. And basically what that is that you're not necessarily changing the facts of what happened, but just give it a different label, and that may actually make you feel better. So we can refer to somebody as either a rape victim or a rape survivor. We're not changing the facts. You know, something bad has really happened to this person. Something terrible has happened to this person. But when I call them a victim, it's a downer. Yet when I use the word survivor, there's actually hope there. You're empowering the individual. So rather than saying that I am weak, for example, let's say when you're depressed, say, no, I'm going through some difficult times at this point. And what that would do is that just the negative labeling of the self is removed away, and that actually helps us in keeping our own sense of goodness. Our self-concept, our sense of self has not been distorted as a result of this negative label that we have applied to ourselves. Reaching out to friends, usually it's just the support system that is around us. You know, making sure that you are in good company, that would be such a great tool, asset. I mean, good friends are a beautiful asset, you know, and that's why, you know, say that's the best, you know, the most beautiful things in life are not things, it is relationships. And what better and more beautiful than a relationship that you can actually count on when you are so down than our friends. You know, here's what we say. Having the correct perception of who God is and knowing Him through His names and attributes and the beautiful qualities that He has told us about is just a cardinal component of having a healthy life. The other thing that you also want to keep in mind is if the higher the gap between where we actually are and our values and principles, meaning that if our values and principles are up here and our actions are down here, this is too high of a gap. That is an invitation to misery. We are actually happiest when there is harmony between what we believe, what our principles are, what our values are, and then our actions are actually a testimony to what we believe and what we value and what our principles are. So what we want to do is close this gap as much as possible, and that is harmony. That is when we acquire that peace of mind. You know, the saying that if what you believe in does not impact how you behave, then what you believe in is not important. So how can you say that God is merciful, yet you have this perception of Him, saying that God opens the doors and He is the dispenser of grace, yet you say that? So that would be an erroneous perception of God, because God does not benefit anything from putting us through miseries. That will not be acceptable. Does prayer, does getting close to God help? It definitely does. And that is why many times actually a therapist would refer clients for some spiritual healing. You know, they would say, fine, I want you to take your medication, take your antidepressants or anti-anxiety pills. I want you to come to counseling so that we make sense out of it. But you know what? I think spiritual healing will also be helpful to you. So you see a lot of people being sent to their rabbi, to their pastor, to the imams. And the point is spirituality can actually add meaning and give explanation to what the person is going through, as well as the idea of instilling hope because of their belief in God. That can also be a very important component of, you know, gaining back our emotional health.